אנו מכריזים בזאת
Hello, this is Barry Shaw. This is The View from Israel. Now, I know that most of you who are watching this show are engaged one way and the other in assisting Israel, explaining Israel's message and countering a lot of the lies and slanders that are being spread against Israel. And I think it's time that we discussed or brought to your attention exactly what's going on in the background and what we're facing. And to help me in this, I've invited a very special guest, Ron Schleifer. Ron, welcome to The View from Israel.
Hi, good morning from Israel.
Good. Ron Schleifer is the head of Research Center for Defense and Communications at Ariel University, and he's an expert in psychological warfare. And one of his books is on the topics of perspective of psychological operations in contemporary conflicts. And really, and this is where it may be relevant to a lot of you, is winning hearts and minds. And he uses the term psyops quite a lot. So Ron, explain to us your background and what's the relevance of the word psyop? It's an abbreviation for what?
Well, my field, I'm an academic, basically, and a consultant, and my field is psychological warfare, or it was previously called propaganda. And as I later explained, propaganda is used mostly nowadays in a pejorative way. So since the Second World War, the American Army has inserted the term psychological warfare. It's been changed ever since so many times. But I prefer the version which was coined at the end of the Korean War and in Vietnam of psychological operations. And the military acronym is PSYOPs. This is the common name after so many changes nowadays. And I'm sure that especially in the US Army, quite a few people are looking for a different terminology to replace the PSYOP, because it's still psychological warfare is still carries the burden of propaganda, which every Western country, every democracy, liberal democracy, is trying to avoid.
This actually goes back quite a while. I want you to speak to us about a man called Arthur Ponsonby. Now, Arthur Ponsonby was a baron, and yet he was a British landed gentry gentleman who opposed going into the First World War. And I'll just give you one quotation that he wrote in 1928, and I have the quote here: "Falsehoods and deceptions are recognized as extremely useful weapons in warfare. It's used quite deliberately to deceive people, to attract neutrals, etc., etc." Speak to me a bit about Arthur Ponsonby and why this man is important.
I came to Ponsonby during my time in Leeds University in the UK, when I did many years ago my PhD on propaganda. And I came back to it. I mean, every time that I'm being asked why Israeli propaganda is a contradiction in terms, or why Israeli propaganda, which is called by an Israeli name Hasbara, is so bad. And there are many explanations for this, many answers for this question. And I always come back to Ponsonby. Ponsonby wrote a book 10 years after the First World War, and the quote that I'm taking from Ponsonby, it's called falsehood in wartime. And his main argument is concentrated in a phrase which he termed. He says it is far worse to corrupt one's soul than kill his body. Meaning, this is a harsh criticism on the British campaign, propaganda campaign during the First World War. The Brits were the masters of propaganda during the First World War. They didn't start it this way, but they evolved, taking in the main newspapers of the British newspapers at the time, and constructing a bureaucratic structure which was quite efficient, though it was changing constantly because of turf wars. And they, for example, a famous example was the Balfour Declaration, that part of it was designed to pull out the Jews from the Austro-Hungarian armies and to promise them a brighter future. Another important document was the 14 points by President Wilson, which enabled or gave the hope that every minority would have the right for self-determination, meaning independence, etc. So this liberal thought that it's better to kill someone than persuade him to pull out of the war has been a streak in Western thought ever since. And what I find when I compare all the propaganda mechanisms that were installed by Western forces, you see the same trend. It is constructed late on the war, and then when the war ends, it is dismantled as quickly as possible. This is, of course, example number one was the Soviet Union, and then the Russian Federation, the Arab world, and they don't have any qualms about the use of propaganda in general, and not about its name, terminology, and all that. This is what I'm trying to do in regards to Israel, that propaganda is not a dirty terminology and concept that needs to be at best treated under the cloak of secrecy. It is, call it what you will, but use it openly, because I disagree with Ponsonby 100%. I don't think it's more evil to corrupt one's souls or to persuade someone to pull out of the war, to fall as prisoner, to stop supporting the war, and rather than kill him. I don't see under any value system how propaganda is more evil than killing someone's physically.
I want to ask you a bit later on about the persuasion of persuading a country to pull out of a war later on. But going on from Ponsonby, I want you to talk about Willie Musenberg. This might be relevant to a lot of American viewers watching this, because America, it seems to us on the outside, and probably you from inside America, seems to be have been taken over by the radical left. And Musenberg, I believe, was a leader of the German communist propaganda machine. So tell me a bit about Musenberg's influence on the radical left, and the difference between him and what is known in American circles as the Frankfurt School, that is influencing, some people say infecting, the body politics in the United States today.
It starts in the, let's say, in the later phases of the First World War. Comes this German communist, a young guy called Willy Münzenberg, and a communist from a very early age, had a difficult family background, and he was exploited. So naturally, he joined the communists to improve the world, and he met Lenin in his exile in Switzerland, and they hit it off together very nicely. And he came to Lenin with the idea. He says that we can sell the concept of communism to the West. On an easy and much less bloody process than we did in Russia. And the basic concept was to use propaganda. Lenin, though the Soviet Republic at the time in the early 20s was poor, gave him enormous amount of money, which goes on to show how important a goal it was for the Soviets. And he constructed a huge network within, it started in Germany and it moved to France, to Italy, to America, of what he termed front organizations. He came up with this concept, which is used to this very day. A front organization is an organization which is designed to promote an idea, a political goal. Its members don't really understand who is running them. This is therefore it's a front. You take good people with good intentions, and they promote those goals, not realizing mostly, some of them do, but not realizing mostly that they are serving something totally different than the goal of their organization. The organization would be controlled from Moscow, either financially or politically, or by having installed people who are not in the front of the organization, not in the presentable first row, but rather on the administrative, mainly financial officers, etc. And this way, the goal would be promoted. One example that comes to mind is the League of Friendship, League of Peace, International Peace Organizations, etc. They were very active during the 50s and 60s against the American Pershing missiles placed in Western Europe, and they were promoting the idea that America is fighting the Soviet Union till the last European. And the slogan was better red than dead, etc., etc. So people were really fighting for peace and fighting for world peace, not realizing that they were promoting Soviet political ambitions. This principle is exercised to this day. Today, the way the BDS works, the Open Society by George Soros works. It's the same principle that was defined and exercised by William Münzenberg. Openly, on the surface, the Frankfurt School were a group of academics, mostly Jewish, who worked first from the University of Frankfurt and other West German universities in the 30s. They were sociologists, psychologists, etc. And they basically were promoting neo-Marxist theories. And they were promoting neo-Marxism in Germany. And then they had to flee, either because they were Marxists and the Nazis didn't like them, or they were mostly Jews, as I was saying, and many of them fled to America. Now, they continued their work in the 50s, and when the New Left movement became prominent in Europe and naturally crossed the oceans to America, they became superstars. Herbert Marcuse and his lot, and they were true believers, and they became the main intellectual leaders of the time, and they sold their merchandise, and the damage is visible till today.
Yes, you may know, of course, that Mark Levine wrote what turned out to be a best-selling book this year, American Marxism. And there's a whole movement from the radical left that seems to have changed America, and it seems aimed at destroying all the traditional values of America, what I call the 3 F's: family, faith, and flag. They're doing it by preaching racism. Anybody white is racist. It's critical race theory, gender questioning, teaching children about things that without their parents' consent. It seems to me to be a deliberate left-wing attack to bring down and tear down what was once traditional democratic values in the United States. Does this come out of either, or did it come out of the Frankfurt School? Is this an ongoing effect of what you've described?
Yeah, it's one and the same. Society needs to be changed, and the way society was changed in the Soviet Union, it had to be it had to be going a social process. For example, the family as a basic societal unit had to change. Sexual promiscuity, feminism, the education, and everything, all are noble goals, but people who promoted it didn't realize that they are promoting political goals. The same rhetoric or the same manipulation techniques which were used by the Marxists 150 years ago. You cannot argue with a Marxist on a rational level because the Marxist says you come from false consciousness. I come from a true consciousness. I have the true idea and the vision, but you're bourgeois, you come from a false consciousness. So there's no way we can communicate. Therefore, you're signed out of the discussion. And this was very effective 120, 30 years ago, as it is effective today. So the mechanisms are the same. The ideas are the same. The terminology is different, but this is just on the surface.
In my opinion, the United States won the military battle in Vietnam, but lost the hearts and minds of Americans. And this relates, I believe, to what a lot of people don't know about. The relationship between Vietnam and a particular Vietnamese general and the Palestinians, initially Yasser Arafat, who visited Vietnam many times to study military strategy and tactics. Ron, give us a background of the connection between Vietnam and the Palestinians.
And one of the early instructions of the Soviet to the PLO was to train them in psychological warfare. In my books, I put in details all those occasions where PLO officials were sent to East Germany, to Hungary, to Cuba, to be trained in media operations and psychological warfare, indoctrination, etc. The current Palestinian Premier Mahmoud Abbas was a student in the Patrice Lumumba International Friendship University in Moscow, where revolutionaries from all over the world were indoctrinated with Soviet techniques of influence, etc. And in the early stage, in the late 80s and in the early 70s, that was even before the war between Vietnam and America was finished. The North Vietnamese knew that they are going to win, and they were exporting their know-how, how a small country can win over an empire. And that was the concept of revolutionary warfare, which is a combination of terrorism, guerrilla, and military operations, and all that is accompanied by a heavy load of the usage of psychological warfare or propaganda. And the one who defined the new doctrine of revolutionary warfare was the Vietnamese general Nguyen Vo Giap. And he was an alumni of the battle against the Japanese who invaded Vietnam. And then later, when the French came back and wanted to reclaim their colonial territory, he fought 9 bitter years with the French until he defeated the French. And then 6-7 years later, when the Americans came, he fought America for a campaign of 15 years and won. And if I can sum up in one sentence, his understanding of the war which he led. The guy was active like 40 years under very strict or under very heavy circumstances. He coined the phrase which says, more than we fought in the jungles of Vietnam, we fought on the streets of Washington. Meaning, in other words, that the essence of war is to influence politics. It's nice if you win battles, it helps, but this is not the utmost goal. The utmost goal is to influence politics. And the way you influence politics, you influence the politicians. And in order to influence the politicians, you influence their constituents, the people who go to vote and demand and present their demands to the politicians. And the way to communicate with the general society is through the media. So Arafat was a good student. He was a very clever man. He was a good student, and later on he switched from international terrorism to politics. The PLO was the feared organization that hijacks airplanes and lands them on deserts and explodes them, fearsome. And then was Munich, 1972. And 2 years later, Arafat is coming to the UN with a branch of olive tree. Now that switch, he stops about talking about terrorism, about violence, and he's talking about the language of human rights and justice, etc. This is the impact of General Giap, and the Palestinians have done this to this day. In Oslo in 1994 onwards, they got a de facto state. They got their own communication channels, enormous amount of funds, etc. If you compare other revolutionary movements in the 70s, there was dozens of them. Nobody came to the status of an observer in the UN. Over 100 embassies around the world, enormous amounts of funds and money to put in advertising, in PR, and receive the same credibility and honoraries as the PLO, or today the PA is receiving.
I want the viewers to know something, again, you probably don't know, that in fact a number of Palestinian Arabs fought alongside the Vietnamese against American soldiers. In fact, there's one man called Anwar Shihab, who is from a village of Anapta, who is buried in a Hanoi cemetery for Vietnamese fighters. By the way, Mahmoud Abbas also visited Vietnam in 2010. So the Vietnamese, in my opinion, taught the Palestinians how to deal with the Western American media and with liberal political circles and institutions, how to win friends and influence people. In my experience with disinformation and lies, I'll give you an example. You mentioned Arafat at the United Nations, November the 13th, 1974, where you quite rightly, he appeared, an ugly, unshaven man dressed in a military uniform with a pistol on his hip, addressed the General Assembly and threatened them, "I've come bearing an olive branch and a freedom fighter's gun. Don't let the olive branch fall from my hand." Now, can you imagine an Israeli leader coming to the United Nations with a pistol and an olive branch saying, "Don't let the olive branch fight from my hand"? I doubt he would be allowed into the United Nations. The way that I fight the disinformation is going on the offense. But I want to ask you, my question to you, Ron, is in this psychological warfare that we're involved in, do we, Israel and our supporters, play defensively or go on the attack?
So far, until I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago, we were on the defense, and that was the reason for a large debate within Israel and an Israel communication with the Jewish diaspora and the Zionist diaspora. It started from the term that Israel has chosen to replace propaganda, and it is called hasbara, which comes from the root of to explain. Now, to explain is something you explain when something went wrong, so you explain why it went wrong. Which is completely alien to the nature of propaganda, in where you attack the enemy directly or indirectly. If you're asking me why is that, it has so many layers of reasons. We start from the top. Is Ponsonby. And Israel is a democratic, liberal democracy in the Middle East, and it sees itself as part of the liberal, democratic Western culture. So therefore, we hate propaganda. Propaganda was to be conducted by the foreign ministry or the prime minister's office, and that is why we don't have the manpower, the experience, the attitude towards propaganda. And when Likud came to power in 1977, he had to start from scratch in order to build its propaganda, or let's say to spread out the control, or thin down the control over propaganda means. And then came the war in Lebanon, 1982, and then it all, every Israeli attempt to make propaganda was eliminated right from the start. So this is the socialist factor. And then if you go deeper into the Israeli psyche, the Jewish people had been apologizing for millennia. The anti-Semitic attacks against the Jewish religion started during the Hellenist period. So we're talking about 2,500 years of attacks, and the Jews have been apologizing ever since. Except for two points in time with the two revolts against the Roman Empire. But except for those two incidents, we've been apologizing. And so there's not much change in that. If you dig even deeper, I would say that despite Ben-Gurion type of activism, there's still lied within the Israeli society and the Zionist, along the Zionist spectrum, a basic fear that maybe this is not the last stop in the long track of Jewish history. And we fight with one hand tied behind our back. The Palestinians, as many others, have realized the desperate Israeli and formerly Jewish attitude of being loved. Please, we are just like you. Why don't you like us? Why are you being anti-Semitic? Why it's a weak point which is very cleverly exploited by our enemies, and this I think all these reasons put together give you an understanding why Israel is reluctant to use propaganda, except of course
Well, I'm sorry, but I understand what you say about we're fighting this fight with one hand tied behind our back. I want to tell you from my perspective and perspective of many people watching this video who are out there on the battlefront, let's say, of this battle, that the Israeli government isn't just fighting it with one hand behind its back, it's fighting it with a muzzle over its mouth. I'll give you a couple of examples. You once said, for instance, quite rightly, that the BDS at that time, the boycotts, divestments, and sanctions, is just the latest in a series of organized campaigns aimed to win the psychological war to bring Israel down. That's exactly right. But at the time, and even today, if we approached any of the embassies or even the Foreign Office to wake them up about what is needed in what we call public diplomacy, not diplomacy, they wouldn't get involved at all. I'll give you one example. I went to Holland a few years ago, before COVID, to talk to both a Jewish audience and also the following day to a Christian audience about Israel. And my talk in the Liberal Jewish Center in Amsterdam was infiltrated by three of the leading members of the BDS movement in Holland. One of them proudly wore a sticker here saying boycott Israel as he walked into my talk. And very quickly, in a nutshell, after I'd spoken to about 40 minutes and then invited Q&A, this guy stood up and wanted to not ask a question, but to explain to the audience what a racist apartheid state Israel was and how deviant we are in imposing an illegal blockade on Gaza. I won't go into all the details here, but I wiped the floor with him in pointing out not only was it not illegal, but in fact 800 trucks a day are going into Gaza from Israel, while 0 trucks a day were going in from Egypt. And why aren't you protesting against the Egyptian embassy if you support the Palestinians? But that aside, a gentleman came up to me, and people came up to me and said, you're giving us information we don't get from the Israeli government. Another gentleman walked up and he was in the audience and he showed me his card. He was from the Israeli embassy. And he said, Kol hakavod, well done. We need more people like you. And I grabbed the woman as she was walking away and said, please, will you tell this representative of the Israeli embassy what you just told me? And I said to him, why aren't they getting this information from you? This is the problem we have in Israel. There are so many people out there volunteering, doing it on their own. I'll give you an example of what goes on in Israel. In Israel, the major organizations who are dealing with public diplomacy, what you call hasbara, I'll just give you just a few of the short people. Stand With Us was founded by a guy from England called Michael Dixon. Honest Reporting, Joe Hyams. Israel Institute of Strategic Studies, Dr. Martin Sherman. NGO Monitor, Gerald Steinberg. Center for Near East Studies, exposing the education of a world without Israel in UNRWA refugee camps. That's David Badin. NGO Monitor, Maurice Hirsch and Itamar Marcus, all of them from abroad. Immigrants into Israel because no Israelis were taking up the cudgels in order to give Israel's propaganda war to go up and fight against the major war we're facing right now. Final point, Ron, before you answer. There was a brief period where we were clamoring at the doors, and the Israeli government created a strategic affairs ministry under Gilad Erdan. They did a good job because they were prepared to listen to voices like UK Lawyers for Israel and other organizations abroad as well as over here. This lasted about 3 years, and then it was disbanded. Gilad Erdan is now in America as US ambassador to the United Nations or America, I'm not sure where, and we don't have it. It's back in the Foreign Office, and they're doing nothing, zero, about fighting the psychological war against our enemies. Can you respond to that?
Yeah, well, first on a personal level, my advice is never get upset, never get emotional, unless it's a show to when you appear to the audience, to an audience. Propaganda is a profession. What I'm more interested in is understanding why this is the situation. It also has a number of explanations. At the top is the Israeli dilemma, how to present itself. Should it be strong or should it be weak? If Israel is strong, it's very good for the Arab world in order to deter the Arabs, but it's very bad to the Western world because strong is aggressive by definition. And vice versa. If Israel is weak, is good for the Western world, but it's very bad image towards the Arab world. So Israel still doesn't know how to play it. As a nation which has been 4,000 years on in existence, we lost in the past 2,000 years, we lost the know-how of how to conduct politics and war. We learned very quickly under harsh duress how to conduct a physical war. But how to conduct the propaganda war, we're still a long way to learn. This is one layer. Another, from a different perspective, is the Israeli, what's the word? I don't think it's translatable. Is the Israeli snotty attitudes that we know everything, and don't you lecture us about anything. We know it all. This attitude is directed towards the Jewish diaspora. And we're saying, if you want to lecture us, first of all, make Aliyah, come to Israel and be an Israeli citizen, then you have the right to criticize us. Israelis don't understand many things about the world, about how different cultures operate. Even though many Israelis speak English or think they speak English, it's far away than true understanding of how the Western mind works. If you want to insult an Israeli politician or a bureaucrat, tell him that his English is poor. This is a bitter insult. The Gilad Erdan ministry was not a serious step to fight to fight anti-Israeli propaganda. It was a political solution inside politics on behalf of Bibi Netanyahu. And I understand it's the political constraints that Netanyahu was working under, but Netanyahu, I don't want to go into politics, but just like any other Israeli prime minister, clipped the wings of the foreign ministry. And this is a process that started this 5 decades ago. It's not anything new. It reflects to the struggle between Moshe Sharet and David Ben-Gurion in the 50s. And the foreign ministry has been undermined ever since.
Yes, and I can tell you, stemming out of what I said before, I firmly believe that it takes a network to defeat a network. We can't simply rely on, in fact, we're not relying at all on the Israeli government to do the work for us. And yes, it requires a budget. Yes, it requires a lot of effort, volunteer or otherwise. But we are reaching into campuses, etc. One of the things that I did that really got me started on this is many years ago, I wrote an article because you talk about the BDS, the Boycott, Divestments and Sanctions Organization. And I wrote an article many years ago that which went viral around the world. I was surprised by that. And the name of the article is, if you're going to boycott Israel, do it properly. You know, basically, it was humiliating the BDS activists by saying, oh, you're telling other people to boycott Israel. How about throwing away your phone, your medication, your communication system, etc., because they're all Israeli-made. But that was one way of doing it. And that led to actually another book, which is behind me, called BDS for Idiots. It's part of my attempt to rival the propaganda against us, is to expose these people as, A, they don't really care for the Palestinians at all. Secondly, they're liars and deceivers, and they don't know what they're talking about if you try and engage them, which I don't all that often, into a proper debate. But the heart of my research is another book I wrote, which is called Fighting Hamas, BDS, and Anti-Semitism. Because once you identify the bulk of the attacks against Israel as being anti-Semitic at source, and you can identify it and expose it, I think this is a way in order to fight what you call the propaganda war. Do you agree with that?
Okay, let's start with anti-Semitism. I fully agree with Professor Deborah Lipstadt, who commented that anti-Semitism is like it's a disease. It's like herpes. It lies dormant and it breaks out. It pops up under certain conditions. Catholic Church did that, then the Protestant did that on demand. And then the Russians did that in order to save their failing regime in the 19th century. And then the Nazis did that. And now the Arab world is doing that. So you have to take it rationally and understand there are people who are behind that, and they're using that for political goals. This is issue number one. The second issue is even harder to deal with, because essentially, I believe, and I assume you and the viewers will realize why, the conflict, the Arab-Israeli conflict, is a religious conflict, is essentially a religious conflict. And it started with politics. I mean, it started by Muhammad in the 7th century, but it started again when the Jews came to the land of Israel, and especially when they beat up the Arab Muslim armies, and not one of them, but many of them. Now, that was a religious issue. How come that the Din al-Batil, meaning the religious, which is canceled, Judaism and Christianity, how come they win when it comes to Islam? And that raised a theological issue, which is very dangerous, because if the Jews are winning, there's a problem with Islam. There's a problem with the Islamic theology. And that cannot be, because Muhammad is the last true prophet. So he, and everything he said is true. So therefore, we need to remedy rectify the situation, and we have to wipe out the Jewish state. The Jewish state it's not an insult, it's a theological problem.
Perhaps Ariel University hosting a conference on winning what you would call the psychological war being waged against us, winning the hearts of mind. It takes a network to defeat the networks. I think it would be a very good thing. I think it would be a magnet for people both involved in this issue and the experts on the issue to come together and have a day-long conference, each with a separate topic and a panel of expert speakers. I hope you could consider that, Ron, but thank you for being my guest. Is there any words you'd like to wrap up with?
You have my number. I'd support any academic or non-academic effort which relates to propaganda, how it is done, how it can be reversed, how to attack the attackers. I'll say just one thing about Arab propaganda. The Palestinian Arabs have not invented one item, one thing, 1% of original thought, except for the suicide bombing. All the Palestinian Arabs have done in terms of propaganda is to copy Jewish pre-state propaganda effort towards gaining an independent Jewish state. And they have reverse engineered everything that the Jews did until 1948. So the lesson is what, unfortunately, or ironically, what we have to do now is to replicate what the Palestinian Arabs have done to us, copying us in the first place. So we have to go back to ourselves of the pre-1948 years, when we fought Britain for independence on the propaganda battlefield.
Yes, I think you sold the Palestinians short, because they actually invented also plane hijacking. So give them credit for that. But okay. Thank you for being on the show, and I look forward to speaking to you again. Maybe cooperating on creating this conference, which I think is badly needed. Thank you for your time.
You're very welcome. Anytime at your service.
Viewers, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned a lot, and please share it. Click on the like button. And this is Barry Shaw, the View from Israel, saying shalom. Thank you.